Good afternoon. So for my final lesson, I decided to do segment 8, which is inheritance of traits. In this segment, there are several different concepts. Segment 8.1 describes the probability of traits in a population. Segment 8.2 describes the genetic variation. Segment 8.3 describes the environmental factors, and segment 8.4 describes the chromosome coding. And for this lesson, I decided to stick with 8.1, which is again the probability of traits in a population. So basically, what this topic is describing is DNA, genes, inheritance, and the use of Punnett squares. So what I had planned for the students to do is to create a monster as a group. And in this activity, students will be divided into groups of 4. And so my planning is to already have those students in desks or rows of 4. And then that group of 4 will break off into pairs, and they will actually end up doing this activity together and then coming together as a group to discuss what they did in their activity. So each of these pairs will share a worksheet that has several different characteristics on it. They will end up flipping a coin twice to determine what traits their monster will end up having. So this includes the genotype along with the phenotype. They will again do 2 rounds of that, write down the data they establish, and then once they're completed, they will go ahead and create their monster based off of the traits that were dominant on their worksheet. Once they completed that, then as a group of 4, they will share their results, and then we will go ahead and get into our classroom discussion. So again, this page pretty much discusses the activity instructions that I just went over. Instead of so wordy though, I tried to bullet point them so it was a little bit easier to read. And then I also attached the activity sheet. We're going to go ahead and go to that next slide. So these are the activities sheets that the students will be getting. And I also attached a copy of these documents so you would be able to read them a little bit closer. But basically, this is going to come in a little pack. Again, they're going to be working in pairs. On the front page, it just goes over the instructions again. So it discusses how they are going to flip a coin twice to determine what genotype their monsters will get. So heads will count as dominant, and then the tails will count as recessive genes. I also felt a need to put on there genotype and phenotype, just because a lot of times those can sometimes get confusing. I had already planned on going over that in class before we get into this activity, but again, just reiterating what those two are, I think will really help the students understand and then turn that into memory, hopefully. Over here, we see the traits that their monsters can have, along with the genotype and the phenotype. So they'll flip that coin. Say they flip it once. I put an example down here. Say they flip it once and it's heads. So that will be big B because that's the dominant one. Say they flip it again and they get tails, which is little b. That will be a recessive gene. So their genotype will be big B, little b, and then their phenotype will be round. So again, they'll go through all of these, and then once they get through everything, they'll then go to their drawing and they'll create their monster and then share as a group. So some guiding questions for our activity are: what is the chance of a trait being passed down from one generation to another? So in other words, describe the significance between the genotype and the phenotype and basically what that looks like. Number 2, by using the Punnett square, explain how genes determine traits. So up here I just put a little Punnett square. So as a class, we will have this on the board and we'll go into a further discussion based off of that guiding question. And the third question says, describe the importance of understanding genetic variation and in what ways could it help us in our world today? So I thought this question was pretty important because it stretches the students' minds to think outside the box. In other words, outside the Punnett square, just for giggles there. But just having them think about how we could use this idea, what we created in class today, in the real world. So just basically the importance of genetics, and just, again, to really make them think outside the box. So for the hook, unfortunately, I can't show the video. I should have thought about that ahead of time. But if you click this link and you start it from point 59 and stop it at 155, this link is from the movie Monsters, Inc. And it's a pretty funny clip, but it basically just shows all of the monsters walking in, and they all look different. So in other words, they all have different phenotypes that we can see, along with genotypes which we cannot see. And I wanted to use that as my hook because, one, that is making the students more interested in what we're learning, and two, they can connect it to a movie that is typically pretty funny. And the point of the clip is trying to determine what monster is the scariest. So at the end of the video, the class will be prompted to share the differences between the monsters and what separates them from one another. So in other words, characteristics such as their outside look, which ones are scarier compared to the other ones that are not so scary. And then we will dive into how genetic variation plays a role in our everyday lives. So the lab procedure. So what I plan on saying to the students, now that we have learned how traits are passed down from one generation to another, the difference between dominant and recessive traits, and how to use a Punnett square, we are basically genetic experts. It must run in our genes, huh? We are going to take it to the next level though. Today, each of us will be creating a monster to see what traits it inherits and discussing the characteristics it takes for a monster to reach the top of the scare leader board. We will be working in our group tables and pairing up. This means that the 4 of you in your group will split up into 2 groups of 2. When we hear the word monster, what word? One leader from the group will jump up quietly, grab 4 activity sheets from the front of the room and 2 coins, sit back down, and begin working. We will have 20 minutes to do this activity. How long will we have? And what will we be doing? Monster. So again, that is what I plan on giving my students as far as instruction-wise goes before we get into our activity. Here's another slide. I planned on posting this in the front of the room. That way, if students do get confused on what we are doing, this is also on the board, on their worksheets. So again, if they have any questions, it's basically posted everywhere. So some group expectations and accountability I have for them is this activity is meant to be fun and engaging, but also it's to help students understand how different traits are inherited and why it's so important in our world today. So I expect students to read the instructions and to follow the tasks given on their activity sheets, record the data accurately, work as a team. So in other words, both students in the group should be participating. Not just one should be doing all the work. Be engaged during the group and classroom discussions, and to understand the purpose of this activity and the significance it can have in our world. So some processing questions I planned on giving the students after we debrief from our activity is to explain the difference between genotypes and phenotypes, reflect on how utilizing the Punnett square allowed us to measure traits within a population sample, and to connect how genetic variation in Monsters Incorporated activity applies to living species. I thought this question was definitely important to add in because then we can connect it to not only us as humans, but agriculture in general. So whether it be animals, plants, you name it. For our exit ticket, I planned on having the students write on a piece of paper one question they have concerning genetic variation or using the Punnett square. I figured this would be a great opportunity for them to write any additional questions down that they have, and also for me to kind of get an understanding as to where they are at and what areas we need to cover the following day. I also encourage them to list 2 ideas they learned from today's activity and their favorite trait that was passed down from their monster. So this is my lesson that I planned out. I'm really excited to use it in the future. As much work as it took me, that's why I'm excited to use it. I know there is always room for improvement, so I am definitely excited to hear back from you on that. And yeah, I just want to thank you.